there comes a moment in life when you simply get tired, not the kind of tired that sleep can fix, but the kind that grows from years of explaining yourself to people who never truly listened. You try to express your heart, you try to justify your choices, you bend yourself into shapes so others will see your goodness, your truth, your side of the story. But somehow, they still don't. And one day, you realize something quietly devastating. They were never listening to you at all. They were listening to their own minds, their beliefs, their wounds, their fears reflected in your words. That's when the exhaustion sets in. Not because you're weak, but because your soul knows the truth. Peace was never meant to be argued for. We spend so much of our lives trying to prove we're right, that our intentions were pure, that our hearts were misunderstood. But every explanation is another knot in the rope that ties you to misunderstanding. The more you try to clear your name, the more tangled you become in their perception. Because understanding was never your job, it was their capacity. You can explain yourself 1,000 times to someone who only wants to see their version of you, and you'll still be the villain in their story. At some point, you stop trying to edit their story, and you start writing your own in silence. That silence, the one you once feared, would make you invisible, turns out to be your sanctuary. Because peace doesn't live in being right. It lives in no longer needing to be. Why do we explain ourselves? Why do we chase understanding as if it were oxygen? When we were children, love often depended on explanation. You had to explain your tears to be comforted, explain your mistakes to be forgiven, explain your dreams to be taken seriously. We learned early that being understood meant being safe, and being misunderstood meant being alone. So we carried that into adulthood. We built our identity around making sense to others. We trimmed our edges, softened our voice, turned our fire into warmth, all so that nobody would leave. But the truth is, people don't leave because they don't understand you. They leave because they can't meet you where you are. And that's not a failure, it's simply reality. You cannot force someone to see you when their eyes are still closed. The ego, however, cannot bear to be unseen. It confuses misunderstanding with rejection. It hears silence as judgment. It believes that if only it explains a little better, a little louder, a little longer, someone will finally nod and say, "Ah, now I get you." But even when that happens, it's temporary, because people understand you only through the lens of their own experience, and that lens is always changing. Trying to maintain understanding is like trying to hold a wave still. You can't. It was never supposed to be fixed. The need to explain comes from fear. The fear that your worth depends on being approved of. But your worth has nothing to do with who agrees with you. It lives quietly, like a mountain that doesn't need to announce itself. The mountain doesn't argue with the wind when it's misunderstood. It simply stands patient, unmoving, knowing that the wind will pass and truth will still remain. Every time you defend yourself, you hand over your peace to the courtroom of someone else's mind. You think you're fighting for truth, but really, you're fighting for control. You want to control how they see you, what they think, what story they tell about you when you're not around. But here's the painful secret. You can't. People don't see you as you are. They see you as they are. And no amount of words can rewrite their conditioning. The moment you start defending yourself, you've already lost your peace, because defense means you've accepted their misunderstanding as valid. You've agreed to play in a field where truth must prove itself. But truth doesn't prove, it simply is. Arguing with misunderstanding is like shouting into an echo chamber. The louder you speak, the louder your own frustration bounces back. Have you ever noticed how explaining yourself never really helps? The more you try to clarify, the deeper the confusion gets. Because the person listening isn't hearing your words. They're hearing their judgment rearranged into sentences. And when you realize this, something shifts inside you. You stop trying to fix perception. You stop trying to chase closure in conversations that only open more wounds. You learn to pause, to take a breath before answering, to smile instead of defending, to walk away rather than argue. It's not weakness, it's wisdom. Because peace isn't found in winning arguments. It's found in no longer needing to attend them. The cost of constant defense is your energy, your sleep, your self-respect. And the moment you stop paying that price, you begin to recover something priceless. Your stillness. Stillness doesn't need to be right. Stillness doesn't need to explain. Stillness already knows. Silence is misunderstood. People think silence means defeat, that if you don't respond, you've surrendered. But real silence is not surrender, it's mastery. It's the quiet confidence of someone who no longer needs to fight for what's already true. There's a point when you realize you don't owe anyone an explanation for your peace, your choices, your healing. You can apologize when you've harmed someone, yes. But you don't have to justify your boundaries, your distance, your growth. Sometimes the most spiritual act you can perform is to say nothing at all. Because silence has its own way of speaking, and it's far louder than words. When you stop explaining yourself, you create space for others to reveal who they truly are. Some will grow curious and move closer. Others will fill your silence with their own assumptions. Let them. Their interpretation of your quiet is not your problem. It's their mirror reflecting their own noise. Your peace doesn't need to prove its existence. It only needs your permission to stay. The ego loves noise because noise feels like importance. But peace thrives in simplicity, in the power of not reacting. You begin to see that silence doesn't mean you're losing, it means you stop playing. The ones who misunderstand your quiet were never listening in the first place. And those who truly know you don't need your words to understand your heart. When silence becomes strength, you don't disappear. You become undeniable. Because peace doesn't argue. It simply stands there, radiant, while noise exhausts itself trying to explain what it will never comprehend. At some point, you must give people permission to misunderstand you. Because if you don't, you will spend your whole life clarifying a sentence that was never meant to be understood by them in the first place. People hear through the walls of their own minds. They listen through filters built from their upbringing, fears, and desires. And no matter how carefully you speak, your truth will still sound distorted in another person's echo. You could be honest and still be called cold. You could be kind and still be called manipulative. You could explain every detail of your heart, and they would still only see the parts that match their story. So, what do? You stop trying to win in someone else's imagination. You see, misunderstanding is not your failure. It's simply life reminding you that perception is not in your control. When you let others misunderstand you, you're not giving up on communication, you're giving up on control. you're allowing reality to be as vast and unresolvable as it actually is. Because truth doesn't need to be unanimous. It doesn't need to be seen to be real. When you're at peace, you'll notice something strange. The people who once demanded your explanations will grow quiet, because your stillness leaves them nothing to fight with. Misunderstanding feeds on reaction. Starve it with silence. You'll be amazed how quickly noise dies when you stop offering it oxygen. And in that quiet, something beautiful appears. The realization that you never needed to be understood to be whole. You only needed to understand yourself. Let them think what they must. Their opinion is their story, not your truth. When you stop trying to be understood, you start to become free. Peace is not weakness, it's clarity. It's what remains when you've exhausted every argument and realize that truth was never hiding in words anyway. There's a certain dignity in not responding. It's not about superiority, it's about preservation. Because every argument drags you down to the level of noise. And once you're down there, no one can tell who's right, only who's louder. Peace doesn't shout. It doesn't perform. It doesn't need applause or agreement. Peace simply is. And that's why it confuses people. Because in a world obsessed with reaction, your stillness looks like mystery, even arrogance. But only you know what's happening within. You're not withdrawing. You're protecting. You're not indifferent. You're grounded. There's a profound power in letting your truth remain unspoken. When you stop defending it, it becomes self-evident. You begin to see how every debate, every attempt to set the record straight, was actually a plea for validation. You weren't fighting for truth. You were fighting to be seen. But truth doesn't need witnesses. It stands quietly, even in the dark. Peace doesn't argue because it has already won. It has nothing to prove, nothing to lose. The loudest voice in the room is rarely the clearest, and the quietest soul often holds the most certainty. You'll notice this when you stop reacting. When someone throws accusation or misunderstanding your way, and instead of defending, you breathe. You realize that what they're saying isn't about you, it's about them. And suddenly, your peace returns not because you won, but because you no longer needed to. The mind loves conflict. The heart loves silence. And peace, real peace, is when the mind finally listens to the heart and says, I don't need to explain anymore. That's when life becomes still again. To be misunderstood is a kind of grace, a strange and painful one, but grace nonetheless. Because misunderstanding forces you into solitude, and solitude is where understanding finally begins. When people misread you, reject you, or twist your intentions, you feel that sting of isolation. But that very space, the one left empty by their absence, becomes the womb of self-awareness. You begin to ask, who am I when no one agrees with me? Who am I when there's no applause, no approval, no echo? And in that silence, you find something sacred, a version of yourself that doesn't need translation. You start to enjoy the company of your own mind. You stop explaining your peace and begin to live it. That's the hidden gift of being misunderstood. It forces you to find validation inside rather than outside. It teaches you that loneliness is not punishment, it's purification. Because when everyone understands you, you risk losing yourself to belonging. But when no one does, you're finally free to belong to truth. Some of the most peaceful souls in history were the most misunderstood. The mystics, the poets, the thinkers, the wanderers. They walked alone not because they hated people, but because they outgrew the need for explanation. They realized that language can't carry silence, and that truth loses its purity when it's forced to persuade. To be misunderstood is to walk the narrow bridge between love and freedom. And if you can keep your heart soft while being misread, if you can remain kind without needing to be right, then you have touched real wisdom. You've stepped beyond the fragile world of reputation and entered the eternal one of essence. Being misunderstood frees you from the cage of others' minds. It is not rejection, it's release. And then, one morning, perhaps after a long night of overthinking, perhaps after one more argument that ended nowhere, you wake up and realize you don't care to explain anymore. It's not bitterness. It's not giving up. It's peace. You stop defending your past. You stop justifying your choices. You stop oversharing your healing process to prove you're doing better. You simply live. You realize that the people meant for you don't need your explanations. They can feel your truth in your presence. They sense your energy, not your defense. And for those who still misunderstand, you bless them silently and walk away, because peace isn't loud. Peace doesn't chase closure. Peace doesn't scream, "Believe me." It simply whispers, "I know who I am." That whisper is enough. You no longer chase understanding because you've found something better, acceptance. Not from the world, but from yourself. You begin to see how explaining yourself was just another form of fear. Fear of being unseen, unloved, unwanted. But once you accept yourself, once you rest in the quiet, knowing that your heart is clear, you realize you were never unseen at all. Life has been seeing you all along. The universe doesn't need your defense. It needs your alignment. It doesn't ask you to be right, it asks you to be real. When you reach that stillness, you start living differently. You listen more, react less. You forgive quicker, hold lighter. You smile without needing to be understood. And that's when you understand what Alan Watts meant when he said, "Muddy water is best cleared by leaving it alone." You stop stirring, stop fixing, stop proving. You leave it alone. And slowly, the water clears. You realize peace was never found in the explanation. It was hiding all along in your silence.